Dutch Foreign Ministry had the very good idea that they should give us some money so that we could produce a series of talks that, through some back and forth, we came to call the New America series. The idea being that there are different things going on in the U.S. these days, and it would be interesting for Europeans to get a perspective of different perspectives on how America is viewing the world and its relationship to the world. We had this, from the beginning though, the idea was that this would be very broadly, very loosely defined. The first event in this series was with the novelist Joseph O'Neill, whose novel Netherland is a loose, it sort of follows his own biography and being moving from the Netherlands to England to New York and exploring, you might say, 21st century post-9/11 multiculturalism through outer borough cricket players. The next talk was with Amy Chua, who is a law professor at Yale University, who had a novel theory about empires and how they work and don't. And this is the third event in this series with Christopher Caldwell, who is, I will not make the mistake of introducing him because we have an introducer who will introduce him. But he has, I think, the most carefully reasoned position on the question of immigration in Europe and how it's changing Europe. Whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree with it, it's the most, I have found, the most articulate argument for one side. And as his interlocutor, we have Joris Luyendijk, who is well known to many of you. He's a prominent Dutch Islamic scholar, journalist. He, as is appropriate for an Islamic scholar, he got part of his training in Kansas. He also studied in Cairo and got a doctorate in religious anthropology. His books include A Good Man Sometimes Beats His Wife, A Tip of the Veils, and They're Almost People. He has been a correspondent for the Volkskrant, the NRC, NOS, and he has been a presenter on Zomergasten and Wintergasten, so he is truly a man for all seasons. Our moderator, Joris Luyendijk.
Thank you. I am the introducer. I always get very bored with introductions, so I'll keep it brief. This is a great book, if only because it is after 3 centuries of being utterly ignored. Holland actually plays a very important role in this book. It deals with the impact of Islamic immigration on Europe, and Dutch intellectuals actually feature prominently. So that is to me enough to make this evening a success, and the reading of the book a pleasure. Christopher Caldwell is, I think, if you don't know who he is, you probably didn't come here. So you probably already know. What is, I think, very interesting is the width of the sort of magazines he writes for. So you will find his name both in the London Review of Books, which is seen as pretty much on the far left, as well as the Weekly Standard, which is pretty far on the far right, and the New York Times and the Financial Times. And of course, I Googled the poor man all afternoon, and it's amazing how hard he works. I think there are several of them, actually. He will give a presentation of about 20 minutes. After that, as the introducer, I will double as the interlocutor. We will have a conversation for, I think, about half an hour. And then it will be up to you to ask questions and to engage him in a conversation. And so let me ask for a warm and welcoming applause for Mr. Christopher Caldwell.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'd like to thank the John Adams Institute and everyone else involved, Russell Shorto, Joris, and all of you, as I say. Since we're at a place that's dedicated to American and Dutch interactions, I thought I would start by quoting something from the woman who has, I think, a fair claim to be the greatest American novelist and who had a lot of interaction with the descendants of your Dutch families, Edith Wharton. In a book that she wrote after World War I called French Ways and Their Meaning, she had this to say about the challenges of writing about foreigners. She said, there are two ways of judging a foreign people. At first sight, impressionistically, in the manner of the passing traveler, or after residence among them, soberly, advisedly. Of the two ways, the first is often the most fruitful. The observer, if he has eyes to see and an imagination, will be struck first by the superficial dissemblances, and they will give his picture the sharp suggestiveness of a good caricature. So this is, I read this when I was reading my own book on Europe, and there was, as I was writing my own book on Europe, and there was something about Wharton's honesty that I admired a lot. Here's a woman who spent much of her life in France, who speaks its language like a native and knows its literature and culture intimately. And what she's saying is that all of these people who profess to want a subtle, profound, and unbiased account of life in France, they really don't. What they want is an account that sort of confirms their own prejudices and caricatures. And I'm afraid I think that there's the risk that this is doubly true when you write a book about an issue as politically charged as the present immigration and the growth of a multi-ethnic society in Europe. You know, people tend to call your book subtle and profound and unbiased to the extent that they like it, and crass and uncalled for to the extent that they don't. I think that a lot of people in Europe, oftentimes the argument proceeds as if there are only two possible outcomes to this unprecedented migration. It's either outright doom for Europe, or there's no problem at all. And because in much of my book, I'm somewhat pessimistic about Europe's prospects for assimilating immigrants in the short term, it can be assumed, it is sometimes assumed that my book is one of those doom books. So for instance, yesterday, a woman in The Hague asked me, you know, Muslims make up only 5%, 10% of 5% of Europe's population, and in another generation there'll be 10%. So how come you're saying that Islam is going to take over Europe? And what could I say? I had to tell her that the problem, I think, is much more complicated than that. Islam is not taking over Europe and will not anytime soon. But this does not mean that the continent is going to be fine if it can just smile politely through all these challenges. The problem that I describe is of a different kind. What I'm talking about in my book, and what I'm talking in my book is it's a change in institutions and mentalities in Europe that has been profound but gradual. And because it has been gradual, I think it's left a lot of Europeans feeling like something has been foisted on them without their democratic consent. Now, revolution, which is a word in my title, is a strong word. But I don't think it's too strong a word. It's a word that we often use to describe what happened in the U.S. between roughly 1840 and 1925, when we received millions of migrants from the mostly Catholic countries whose cultures differed a lot from those of the American Protestant native commercial culture. Unassimilated migrants were never a majority of the United States, or anywhere near it. The United States was never taken over by immigrants, although it must be said they did come to monopolize the politics of certain large cities, such as Boston, and, an important point, to change them forever. something like this is happening in Europe. And just as it would have been absurd to expect those who inhabited 19th century America to rejoice at the change, it's unlikely that Europeans will all rejoice in the changes they're now undergoing. Europe has gone from a culture in which rules for living together and identities go without saying to a culture in which rules for living together need to be negotiated and renegotiated. And identities are contested between ethnic and cultural, and particularly cultural groups. We can debate the pluses and the minuses of multicultural societies, and my book does so at almost interminable length. But one thing I think is certain, that multi-ethnic societies require more rules than homogeneous ones do, because fewer things go without saying. Now, America eventually came up with a new set of rules that both immigrants and people of so-called native stock could live under. I think Europeans believe that they're somehow automatically going to get what Americans have got. But I think that there was nothing inevitable about our own assimilation of immigrants. Our record in mediating between groups is not perfect. In particular, of course, you know, the record of mediating between blacks and whites in the United States has enjoyed some recent successes, but it is, let us not forget, a history of 4 centuries of violence, shame, and wasted human potential. So I should say that one of the themes of my book is that there is a lot in the immigration situation that reminds me of the American immigration history, but there's just as much that reminds me of the American race problem. And so if I could dwell for the next few minutes on a few ways in which I think that Europe's situation differs from the American 19th century situation, that will make it more difficult for Europeans to come together quickly as one culture, come together, you know, natives, newcomers, and all. America in the 19th century was a dynamic, open country with a continent to populate. Europe is, in many regards, one of the least dynamic parts of the world today. It's very pleasant. It's a very successful society, but it is not Shanghai. So the opportunities for people coming are not, it's not a wide open place in a way that arguably the United States was in the 19th century. A second thing is that technology in our day tends to favor continued separation for those who arrive from other cultures rather than assimilation. Our American immigration, the immigration that made us a nation of immigrants, happened in the context of unifying national newspapers. And there is no such culture today. An immigrant coming to Paris can watch Al Jazeera. An immigrant coming to London from Pakistan can read The Dawn. A third factor, when we had our mass immigration, people discussed it in all sorts of forums. People were very curious about what kind of country immigration was turning us into. I think that this discussion has been severely constrained by Europe, and to figure out why it has been constrained is a very complicated argument about repentance over the Second World War and, to a lesser extent, colonialism. I should also add that I think that the discussion of immigration as a policy, is less constrained in the Netherlands than it is elsewhere in Europe, which is one of the reasons I have found it so fruitful to come here. But the biggest difference, I think, between the United States and Europe in this century is Islam. This is something that you can dance around any way you want, and most commentators on European immigration do. I myself often do. You can talk about building bridges of understanding, which is absolutely necessary. We can strive to keep international conflicts from exacerbating domestic ones, although this is sometimes easier said than done. And it should go without saying that we need to always honor our commitments to our fellow citizens. But Islam is not just an opinion, as some people think. It's a system for organizing one's life. And we're living at a time when a lot of people in both the Muslim and non-Muslim worlds believe that Islam is at odds with the West. And many have even taken up arms in that belief. This is a problem that the United States, apart from a limited amount of anarchist sentiment in the late 19th century, hasn't had. I hope I don't have to say that I am not making a monolithic portrayal of Islam here, and we can agree that we're talking about is probably a minority of people who take this view of a hard conflict between the West and Islam. But it is a problem that complicates this immigration immensely. It is very important, though, when we talk about this, that this particular aspect of the problem is in large part an accident. It's not a result of any conspiracy or ill will on anyone's part. First, there's an accident of geography. Europe borders on the Muslim world. That's the closest source of low-wage labor for this part of the world, much as Latin America is for us. But second is an accident of history. Europe began recruiting immigrants from the lands that border on it at a time when no one was really paying much attention to religion at all. Since that time, we've seen a great resurgence of world religion. In every place in the world except Europe, we've seen a big resurgence of Christianity in the United States, or at least of a public Christianity that makes itself part of the national political conversation. And we have seen a resurgence of Islam, particularly political Islam. And that has influenced the newest land of Islam, which is Europe. The fact that things happen this way mean that Europe faces bigger challenges in assimilating its newcomers than the United States did. And before I finish, I'd like to get to one of the parts of my book that I think is often easily misunderstood. I think to be pessimistic about Europe's prospects for building a multi-ethnic society in the near term is often spoken of as an anti-Muslim sentiment. I don't think it is. I think on the contrary. I think one of the difficulties in assimilating immigrants from Muslim countries is that religions are not things that immigrants readily give up. And I think that it's been our experience in the United States that people today tend to have the religions that their mothers' adopted in, Sicily or Poland or wherever hundreds of years ago. I have to say that a lot of European discussion about these issues casts the tension between Muslims and non-Muslims in Europe as a tension between the European Enlightenment, between an advanced civilization on the other one, on one hand, and a sort of a backward superstition on the other. And in this idea, religion appears as nothing more than a sort of a consolation prize. It's the way people occupy their time if they don't have jobs or self-esteem. And the idea is that over time, if we treat these immigrant communities with respect and offer them opportunity, they will cease to pose any problem because they will no longer need their religion. This is an attitude that I disagree with pretty much 100%, and I don't understand why it's considered a respectful attitude to hold. Why it's considered respectful of Islam to believe that those who practice it will inevitably, let's say, surrender to the superior logic of the West. Our immigration hasn't worked that way, and I don't see that the European immigration necessarily will, too. I will say, I'm skeptical, let me say, that religion is something that can be educated out of people. There will be syncretism, yes, and there will be a European type of Islam. Muslims in Europe will take on certain European comportments. But I think that Europeans have been over-optimistic about the degree to which they can steer that development. And I think that the point at which the culture of those of native background and the culture of the newcomers, the point at which those cultures merge is still far off. So thank you very much.
Let's see. We're both way too tall for this microphone, but if we don't move at all, we just sit like this. Mr. Caldwell, this is very confusing for your introducer, because I read your book, and it's wildly polemic. So I expect a wildly polemic person to have dinner with me tonight at 6 in the Vermeer restaurant. And now this double sits down, and he's really nice.
Yeah. Right. Well,
how does that work?
That's right. Most people who meet me for the first time do expect me to be a raving lunatic. But I'll tell you, I did not write the book to be a polemic. Okay, sorry.
Maybe we need something to put it on. I don't know. Maybe has somebody have a Quran that we can put it on?
Hang on. Is this it?
It's not even on.
Are we on? Oh, gee whiz. All right. Hey, we got it. Super. All right. I'd like to say.
So you were saying you were a raving.
No. I was saying I was a raving lunatic. No, the book. I don't believe I'm very polemical in my attitudes or in my thinking, but in the book, because there has been so much shilly-shallying and sort of confusing talk about immigration, I have tried to pare it down and pare it down and pare it down, and I find I can get a much sharper way of expression in writing than I can in speaking.
Right.
So I've tried to make the book as clear and unambiguous as I possibly can. But and I'm sorry that I didn't live up to your expectations of barbarism.
I didn't say barbarism.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Polemics.
Yeah.
But because I think you basically use 3 categories or 3 units of analysis, which is immigration, Europe, and Islam.
Yeah.
And so then, Islam is described by you as timeless, and you set it up basically as a conflict. So, and you use a war vocabulary. For example, that immigrants establish beachheads, and immigration is supplanting European culture. Immigration is a test of strength between 2 cultures. And, for example, for 1400 years, the Islamic and the Christian worlds have opposed one another, violently at times, you write. Or it can fairly be said that, until its steep military decline in the 19th and 20th centuries, Islam was the arch enemy of European civilization. The hostility towards Europe that simmers in much of the Muslim world. 9/11 was a day of joy in much of the Muslim world. I mean, these are major statements.
Yeah, and I think they're actually factual. Well, we're talking about 2 things here. I think they're factual statements, right? I mean, there were a
historians will tell you
Historians will tell you that this country had a saying, you'd rather be Turkish than papal, meaning we use the Turks to get rid of the Catholics.
Yeah.
So that was not a period when we were violently at odds with the Muslims. Actually, it was the Muslims and us against some other Christians.
Yeah, but that's a sort of my enemy's enemy kind of
But we were
attitude.
also
That does not,
Christians.
yes, but that does not reflect a love of the Muslim world. It reflects a willingness to use them as a military ally against your oppressor.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
I think that because the United States chose to ally itself with Stalin in the course of the Second World War, did not make it a communist country.
That's right.
Okay.
But the idea that the world of Christianity suggests a kind of homogeneous unit. Now, if some in that world of Christianity are oppressing some others, and then they go to the Muslims, then perhaps it is not as clear as you make it out to be in sentence like that.
No, it isn't. And that's one of the things that you have to do when you try to compress an argument like this into 300 or 400 pages,
Right.
as you will remember. But I don't think, I just don't think there's anything controversial about saying that Europe and the Muslim world were in a deep state of enmity for much of the time up until, I think I said, roughly the 18th and 19th century, I mean, there were repeated battles.
There were repeated battles, yeah. The sort of history books that we were forced to read in old Europe suggested it was not only way more complicated, is that history doesn't lend itself to that kind of generalizations of the
Right.
Muslim world.
Right. Well, I totally disagree. I think history does lend itself to that sort of generalization. I think that you can talk about the way Christianity developed between 300 AD and 1000 AD. And just because there were different strains of Christianity and that it varied from region to region doesn't mean that that's a meaningless category, and just because there were periods of relative peace between the Muslim world and the Christian world, and just because there were different Christian countries that had, just because Venice, let us say, had a better relationship with the Muslim world or a closer one than Norway, it doesn't mean that you cannot generalize about tensions between Europe and Islam in the first 1400 years of its founding. And I should say, that these points are made only in passing to, and they're made in contrast to the more, I think, pacific relationship with the Muslim world that existed for much of the 20th century. So I mention those things only in the context of saying that at the time of the mass immigration, there were no such tensions.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, and that's right. I think what I really loved about the book is the way you describe the attitude of the white establishment in which I was brought up, and that sort of absent-mindedly we ended up with immigration of a lot of Muslims.
Right.
And that, as you said, over the 70s and 80s, people simply didn't conceptualize the world as divided in religions. For example, in Suriname, Islam is not a religion. It's not an identity. You're Hindustan, and then you can be Hindu or Muslim. So it's not even, it doesn't define you.
Right.
You just happen to have this house of worship.
Yeah, I've been struck by that that absence of identity too. I mean, I've noticed in Azerbaijan, for instance, Azerbaijan seems to be like the East Germany of the Soviet Islamic republics. I mean, you get it. But you get it in a religious sense, and that you get this was a few years ago that I was there, but you get the sense that people have forgotten how to think about religion as a category, much as you see in Eastern Germany. But I could draw a parallel from my own country. It's always struck me that at the moment Mexican Americans and other Latin Americans who are heavily Catholic and now born again Christian. At the moment they started immigrating in large numbers to the United States, the United States was in the throes of modernizing its laws on abortion and birth control and various other aspects of sexuality. It's very strange that no one thought to ask, might the religious convictions of these people affect the debate that we're having on these very important issues? And I don't think there's any evidence of anyone ever having asked that question.
Yeah.
So you're not alone in having been absent-minded in that way.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a consolation. Sometimes I just had to laugh. You know, and some of these things you write are just amazing. This sort of Europeans have lost faith in parts of their civilization. It's like, and
Yeah, I know.
Europeans, and this is because of in a chapter titled "Fear Masquerading as Tolerance," because of mass immigration, Europeans began to feel contemptible and small, ugly and asexual. And when I
Not
read
all
that,
of you, not all of
When I
you.
read it, I finally realized that this is the reason. It's because of mass immigration that I feel contemptible and small,
Right.
ugly and asexual.
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, you should have thought of that. Yeah. This is not the. No, I don't think that I lay that out as a direct consequence of mass immigration, but I do think that Europeans were taught. This is a complicated process. I mean, I think you have I think that Europeans had to undergo a very necessary repentance after the Second World War, and I think the goal of European leaders, and I don't really mean elites as much as I mean ethicists, philosophers, people who thought really seriously about what is Europe to do after it's just sort of nearly committed suicide and committed the Holocaust and that sort of thing. I think there was an attempt for Europe to, among Europe's philosophers and moralists, to teach the median European a style of moral reasoning. But I don't think it's possible to really teach a style of moral reasoning. I don't think it's really possible to teach, like, respect, you know, you should always respect the other. I don't think the median citizen in a democracy can really make a life's philosophy out of that. I think that what people tend to learn is rules and hierarchies. And I do believe that to a certain extent, Europeans began to believe, I'm a really bad person. I'm representative of a nasty situation, a nasty civilization. And you know, I'm not saying this was universal or that it went to the core of people, but I do think that there was a certain self-disrespect that I don't think it was encouraged, but I think it was a natural misreading of what people thought the lessons to be learned after World War II and after colonialism were.
Mm-hmm. But then, just to return to this feeling of contemptible and small, ugly and asexual,
Yeah.
Because I mean, you do make quite a lot of these statements. I mean,
Yeah.
how many Europeans out of the 400 million are feeling contemptible and small, ugly and asexual?
Well, that's 200 million are contemptible, 100 million are small, and 100 million are asexual. But I'll tell you what. I'll tell you. There are really two. There are really two that I'm
is
quoting.
taken seriously
Yep.
in the U.S. and they read
Yep.
this sort of stuff.
I know.
What are you doing to us?
You're gonna have to prove yourself all over again to the people of the United States.
Yeah, but we feel too ugly.
Yeah.
And contemptible.
In this part, when I talk about that, I'm actually referring to a few passages in European literature. A couple of novels, one by Michel Houellebecq, one by the German novelist Matthias Politicki, and I think I also mentioned Hans Magnus Enzensberger about the self the self-disrespect of certain political campaigners on the left. So I'm drawing on literature there more than on conversations that I've had with Europeans about how they're feeling today.
So yeah, but you do put it in.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I'm just worried that people will take it seriously. That's
Yeah. All right. Okay.
now about that's Europe. So and my sense is that your analysis of the European elites and their way of thinking reflects quite a lot of contact with those European elites. And so to me it felt spot on a lot of the times, except for the asexuality.
Yeah.
About Islam, I wonder, how do you actually see that religion? Because you call it timeless, which means that essentially it will not change.
Oh, no, that's not what I mean by timeless. And I want to stress something very important about the way I deal with Islam. I don't ever write about the content of Islam. And and it's not because I think that's not a worthy subject. It's because when I was going around reporting, I was constantly running into situations. When I was traveling around reporting for this book, I often heard politicians trying to lecture Muslims on what the Koran meant. And this happened certainly when I was in England, and there was a debate over the veil. And you saw members of Tony Blair's cabinet explaining their opposition to the veil or the big veil by saying that the burqa, by saying that there's nothing in the Quran that requires a Muslim woman to go veiled. Well, maybe that's true, maybe that isn't. But I did not want to sort of put my own authority on the line as a person who speaks no Arabic and knows really nothing about the practice of Islam. Because I think it's a dangerous thing to do, to start reading, to start reading contemporary behavior out of Scripture. We have in our Bible, we have an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and we have turn the other cheek. And it's tough to extrapolate from that to any sort of code of behavior that you could call Judeo-Christian. So what I don't, when I write about Islam, I'm writing about it sociologically. It's not, I'm not writing about it as a religious critique. That doesn't appear in the book.
But you do, because you take it as a unit of analysis, is that someone's religion is the overriding factor in that person's identity.
Yeah.
And so then you leave it to the reader to decide whatever that reading is, but you do take it as determining, all determining. And you do say that diversity is overstated.
Right. Well, I agree. I think that might sound a little funny to a Dutch person. I think to an American, the idea of religion is a very important identity, and an identity that can even be more important than your national affiliation. To an American, that's a much more, I think, accessible idea. I mean, in our own country, the reason the most important speech that John F. Kennedy gave in the 1960 election campaign was one where he went to Texas and he told a lot of Protestant preachers that if he were elected president, he would, and there were a conflict between the interests of the United States and the wishes of the Pope, he would choose the interests of the United States. Had he not made that speech, he would have been unelectable, because it was strongly believed, perhaps with some reason, that most Catholics considered their Catholic allegiance more important than their American citizenship. Now, I'm not sure that, I don't mean to generalize across Europe, but I think that is often what we're talking about when we worry about statistics, for instance, that show, I'll just take one that I remember from England, that, for instance, a third of young Muslims in Britain feel they have more in common with their fellow Muslims in other countries than they do with their fellow citizens in England. I think they're probably wrong as an objective matter, but the fact that they feel that way, it reflects an interesting idea of allegiance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there can be instances where such a thing is felt, but because the linchpin of your argument is that this goes for all Muslims, all of the time, and so the counter argument would be that this is determined by context.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think it goes for all Muslims all the time, and I think there's a chapter in this book called "Diversity is Overrated," or at least that's what it's called in the English edition of the book. And I think, and what I'm talking about there is, I think that a lot of people who say that the problems of assimilating Islam will be easy to solve, they do so by saying, well, Islam is such a diverse culture. There are many kinds of Islam. There are Shiites and Sunnis and et cetera, et cetera. And you know, I have to say, I'm perfectly well aware of the magnificent diversity of Muslim culture, and I think it's very impressive on a cultural level. I think on a political level, there are areas where it is not so impressive. If one of your main preoccupations is your country's relationship with the state of Israel, for instance, I don't think you will notice a lot of diversity among the Muslim population. So
it's funny you mention it, because it seems that the only thing that Muslims in Europe can agree on is Israel.
Yes,
it's like the Jews in the U.S. And so the reason they take this on, it's not the tip of the iceberg of this allegiance. It's a fig leaf for the fact that for the rest, they hate each other even more than they hate the rest.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. And but you know, I think there are issues. I think most Muslims in Europe, if you look at polls, were pretty sympathetic to the protesters against the Danish cartoons, for instance. There are episodes like this, but that's looking at it from the side of immigrant sentiment. Now, from the side of native sentiment, which I think is often ignored, because we sort of feel like we don't really have to psychoanalyze the people of the ethnically the native stock people in these countries, because their motivations must be obvious. But when you look at the diversity of phenomena in immigrant Europe, you see a problem like Somalis practicing female circumcision in the Netherlands or Brussels, or you see
Egyptian Christians doing the same.
Oh yeah, okay, right, okay. Or if you see Pakistanis, well, here's another thing. I'm aware that a lot of these things are regional. A lot of them are not inherent to the Muslim religion, but in Europe they tend to be things that are practiced in Muslim cultures. Another one is honor killings, which tend to be practiced in Eastern Turkey. I would say that they're a regional thing. They don't have much to do with whether you're Turkish or Kurdish, or whether you're a devout Muslim or a secular person. You see a lot of it in Eastern Anatolia. Yeah. But I think that when a native looks at this, he does not really see diversity. What he sees is a bunch of institutional changes that are made necessary.
That's perception.
But it's truth. These are institutional changes that are made necessary by the presence of Muslim societies in Europe, and I don't think that's wrong. I don't think that's just perception.
So then, because you can look at polls, but you will agree with me that polls are really, if you look at, say, social science methodology and the way you can it's lying with statistics, essentially, polls. If you ask questions in a different order, you get different answers. So what you would want is to talk to a lot of Muslims to figure out whether their Islamic identity is as important to them as you think it is, and then which interpretation they follow. Now, and so, because I was reading your book and I kept waiting for that chapter to come.
Right.
So then I went to Europe and I spent 2 months speaking to 2 Muslims a day for a good few hours in order to get a sense of what they thought.
Yeah.
But the chapter didn't come.
No, it didn't. I don't think you find me describing my interviews with anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim or anything, anywhere. I mean, it's not I did a lot of interviews for this book. I did a lot of interviews with Muslims. I did a lot of interviews with non-Muslims. But it's not a book in which you find a lot of quotes. It's just not. It's not built that way. It's not a book of anecdotes and stories of reporting. But I did talk to an incredible number of people, I think, over the years for this book.
Yeah. Still, I do wonder if you're talking about 15 million Muslims and you're making these generalizations and you're basing it on the perception of the non-Muslims, which is perception, and then on what Bernard Lewis says, who is on the record as an Orientalist and openly, deeply critical of Islam. And then if you just would speak to 1% of those 15 million, that would be 150,000. 1% of those would be 1,500.
Yeah.
So
I would say I've spoken to less than 1,500.
That's right. So it's less than 1% of 1% whom you've actually seen up close, whether those polls reflect something that people just tell a pollster, or whether they really feel like that. And you would probably need a few hours for that.
Well, I think you're being unfair. This is not a book about Muslims. You know, it's not like saying, "Oh, look at those Muslims." This is a book about how immigration and the consequent need to create a multi-ethnic society is changing Europe, and so this book is every bit as much about Europeans like you as it is about Muslims who have just arrived. And if we, I also think that there's really nothing wrong with quoting Bernard Lewis. You might call him a confirmed Orientalist or whatever. He has his political opinions, I'm sure. He's also I would say probably generally agreed as the leading authority on 20th century Turkey in the world. He's a person who's given some good thought to this. And finally, I think this 1% of 1% thing, I think is not, it's kind of an unfair criterion, because otherwise no one would be able to ever write a story about the world, you know? I mean, you'd need to talk to a million people before you did.
You could address that ambiguity and to say we can't really know how those immigrants feel about their religion.
Well,
which would produce kind of different argument of setting up Islam and Europe as 2 units that are in conflict. Because now that when I question you, you say, well, I don't actually know whether they're in conflict, because I can't really know whether all those Muslims actually consider themselves first and foremost Muslim.
Well, we know that a good number of them do. I mean, we know that through polling, and we know that through sentiments they themselves have expressed. But I can't talk to every person in Europe, and I can't talk to every person in the Muslim world. And at a certain point, you have to simplify with words. I can't talk to everybody.
What do you make of the argument saying that identities are fluid, and we may read back into history that Islam could have been so important, compared to the French and the Germans, who slaughtered each other for 75 years in 3 major wars, and were told incessantly that French and German were historically opposed, that they had been in conflict for as long as anyone could remember, and it would be a test, a test of strength between two nations. And then in 45, we decided to put the propaganda department far away from the defense department. And 70 years later, they're all taking drugs and being ugly and asexual. Now,
Yeah. Well, you know, it's worth remembering that the propaganda department that would like to put an end to these years and years of bloodshed was also at work. You know, you had the League of Nations, you had the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and that didn't work. Now you had a second round of propaganda to try and teach Germans and French people that there are ways for them to get along, and it seems to have taken. There's nothing wrong with making similar attempts in our own conflicts all around the world. I don't think that we need to limit it to Islam and to the West.
But if you had written a book in, say, 1938 or 1943, saying there's such a thing as Europe, Germans would simply have said, no, there's no such thing. You know, because there are French people in Europe, and it's a test of strength between us and them. And so, well, my argument is that if identities like French and German are determined by the context in which they're formed,
Right.
then your book also determines partly, and this is not a call for any tabooization, because a book like yours is highly overdue, but the context in which identities are formed is also influenced by a book like yours.
Well, I can see what you're saying. Am I worried that by defining these issues sharply, I'm going to make the problem worse?
By defining them the way you do.
So essentially, you think I'm essentializing Islam? I don't think I am. I think that a degree of generalization is necessary to say anything meaningful. To say, you know, there were that Europeans are worried about Islam, okay, something like that. Well, we know we're not talking about every European. But I think after 9/11, I think that is an understandable shorthand for saying what you'd say in a longer form. After 9/11, the number of Europeans whose main preoccupation shifted from the usual matters of, you know, domestic politics to worries about potential terrorism stemming from some, but not all, of the people in contentious parts of the Muslim world who were, some of them, but not all of them, affected by, you know, Wahhabism and Salafism, rose. You must understand, I'm not just because I put these things in a simple way does not mean I'm trying to wash away the subtleties. I'm not.
No, but my issue is not with the subtleties. The issue is with the categories you begin with. And so once, if you say, you know, I appreciate very much the highlights of Muslim culture, you already assume that there's such a thing as Muslim culture. And so everything that follows from that is actually, it doesn't really matter, because the main lines are drawn. So as much as I appreciate German culture, and it can never be European, well then whatever kind of finesse you work into it, it still assumes that you can be either European or German, or you can be either Muslim or European.
But I think that you can, you know, I think that maybe you're being too sensitive to the idea that a person who says Islamic culture is being Islamophobic, because I think that it's possible to make the same argument against someone who talks about German culture. You know what I mean? I mean, are we talking about Goethe or are we talking about Nina Hagen? You know, you know.
Well, being asexual as I am, I'd say Nina Hagen.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, you can. If I talk about Christian civilization, this is something that has a meaning. I know, you know, that I know that it's evolved.
Or in reality, because then, let's see. If I was wondered, can you be Muslim and European?
Well, apparently. Yeah, I mean, obviously there are a lot of Muslims in Europe. Yes, why can't you be Muslim
Because
in
your,
Europe?
your argument is constantly about Europeans or natives,
Mm-hmm.
and they're set in contrast to Muslims. So
Well,
when, as
look.
I say, imagine there's a Muslim here, what does he need to do for you to join the natives?
This is a very complicated question, and each society will decide it in his own way. And this is part of the drama of American immigration, is that you probably, it's tough to tell when a person is fully assimilated. It's a matter of states of mind and mentalities. It's a matter of how you view yourself, and it's a matter of how others view you. I mean, at this point, an Italian American is just looked at as a normal American. No one would really meet a guy with an Italian surname and say, there's an Italian American. He's just an American, okay? But that was not the case 100 years ago. And the point between 1910 and 2010 at which that Italian became just an American like any other, I don't know exactly where it was. But so, obviously European, the native stock Europeans have a great deal of trouble thinking of Islam as a European religion. You can see that in things like the Swiss minaret referendum. Now, when I say native stock Europeans, I don't mean all of them, obviously. But certainly Muslims feel like outsiders to Europe, and many of them are not fully at home in Europe. They don't. Many of them still have one foot in their in the identity of their religion rather than the identity of their new country. So it will. I trust it can happen, but I wouldn't be able to tell you when it will happen.
Because it seems that you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, as a Muslim. Because either you integrate, you enter the political sphere, and then the thing is, these people are taking over. For example, when they demonstrate for their the Palestinians that they identify with, you call that rallying behind the Muslim cause. It's imported, according to you, so they participate in the political process, and then they're being accused of taking over, or they don't, and then they're setting up a parallel society. So it's either, what if you were a young Muslim, or you were coaching a young Muslim in Europe, what would you advise him to do?
Well, you know what, one of the things that I've said is that the one thing this book doesn't do is offer advice to Europe on how to assimilate its Muslims. And I'm not really interested in offering advice to Muslims on how to become Europeans either. But I will say that there are plenty of assimilated Muslim Europeans already, okay? So there is obviously a pattern, or there are obviously many patterns to follow to become a European Muslim. You mustn't think that I think this situation is all black or white. I mean, the comparison that I would make would be, say, to the American race problem sometime before the civil rights movement, when you had, there were millions of black Americans who were moving into positions of prominence in the American mainstream. They were not just successful, they were admired, and even better, okay, they were just taken for granted as being part of the furniture, you know? A similar process is, but at the same time, okay, at the same time, you could say that there was a huge problem of not just exclusion, but also of hostility between the two societies, black and white. It didn't apply to all of them, but it was there. I think there's something similar in there's something similar in Europe, you know.
Okay. Hannah Arendt has said that you can only defend yourself as the person you are accused of being.
Mm-hmm.
And she was speaking as an assimilated Jew who discovered that actually she was being marginalized, more and more marginalized. And this quote came to me when I read your book. It's like I was trying to imagine what it would be like as a young Muslim in Amsterdam. Your grandparents came from Morocco, to be constantly told your most important identity is Islam. And quite a lot of young Muslims...
To be constantly told by whom? By the family, or by the greater, wider society?
For example, by your book, or by... maybe in that sense Europe is different from Holland right now, but it's there. The young Muslims tell me that they're constantly being addressed and being called to either excuse themselves or for apologize for 9/11, or to distance themselves from suicide bombings in Israel, or constantly pigeonholed as a Muslim. And they've discovered that this has actually Islamized them.
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of separate things. I don't... I don't tell Muslims that their most important identity is as a Muslim, and I would never assume that about any person. I'm just reporting what other people have found. You know,
it's a catalog of perception.
It's a catalog of not just of perception, but of empirical data. I'm sorry, I agree. I think polls are imperfect instruments, but they're in certain questions like this, they are as helpful as we have. They're as close to a neutral source of data as we have.
Okay. The one person who's not in your bibliography is Edward Said.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read his Orientalism?
No, I've read parts of it. I know that I'm more of a Bernard Lewis person than an Edward Said person.
Well, yeah. I sensed as much. The
well-known, notorious anti-Orientalist Edward Said,
that's
right?
It. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. That's it. It goes down very well with the asexual Europeans. What he's saying, his argument is essentially that much of what has been written about the East and about Muslims wasn't really about Muslims. People hardly went up to them, often even didn't visit the place. What they needed was a contrast. They were trying to form their own identity in the West by creating this counter-image. So the Victorians saw luscious Arabs and Muslims having sex all the time. And then 100 years later, when we were the ones, well, you don't think so, but we were the ones being luscious, we suddenly thought they were prudes. And so his argument is that the West has become the West by projecting on the East its negative mirror image.
Yeah. My objection to that would be that I think that all societies tend to do that. There isn't Orientalism, if it exists, is just it's just a variant of an exoticism that exists in all human beings.
Could it be in you?
Probably. What?
Could it be in you?
If I say it exists in all human beings, there's no doubt that it could.
So that perhaps you're projecting, I'm now going for the European Freudian slip, is that you're actually projecting on those Muslims all sorts of things which are in your mind rather than in their minds.
It's always a possibility, but if it were true, I would be the last person to know.
Good point. Good point. But then, touche. But for example, a sentence like the spiritual tawdriness that Islamic immigrants perceive in the modern West is not imaginary. In other words, you feel that there's a spiritual tawdriness in the modern West.
Well, yeah. Maybe tawdry is tawdry is a strong word, but yeah, I wrote it. I believe it. This is part of what I was getting at in my rambling remarks that I was making a minute ago when I say that I don't think it's good to underestimate the resources that a religious viewpoint on the world gives one. I mean, whether we're talking about Islam as a religion or a particular culture that someone brings with him to a country like this, it's not going to be obvious to that person that what the West has to offer is better, or we can't assume it will be obvious. I mean, as I say, it's our experience in America that really religion is one of the very last things to go when a person is
Becoming
assimilating.
European.
Yeah, well, when a person is assimilating into a culture, and in fact, it very often doesn't go, and you need to. I think that you need to probably learn to live with the religious worldview a little more, rather than assume that it's going to that it's going to disappear in the face of Western secularism.
Or at least, where I would join you, say to allow for that possibility,
Right.
which
Okay.
has been totally denied and tabooized by the European elites over the past decades.
Maybe not tabooized, but yeah, it's not considered. It's not thought about.
Yeah. There are two things, two final things before I turn to the floor. One is that as I was going over sentences, you know, like this most recent encounter with Islam, however painful and violent, has been an infusion of oxygen into the drab, nitpicking, materialistic, intellectual life of the West. The West, not Europe. This is about yourself.
That's right.
And here, there's a lot to be said for placing a high value on chastity and virginity, because chastity and virginity can further dignity, responsibility, and self-respect. Now that really didn't, that's not what I thought when I was 15 and desperate to get laid, that I was working on my dignity and self-respect. I realized, where have I read this before? And I see in the reviews on the net, it comes out clearly. There's really one set of reviewers which agrees with you, which are sort of the musliminamerica.org.
Really?
Yeah,
God
they
bless
quote,
them.
they quote all this, and they say,
That's great.
He's one of us.
They say that.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
on that account.
That is interesting. You know, I remember when I wrote the first experience I had with this came when I wrote an article on Holland. It was shortly after the Fort Town killing, and you know, someone wrote an attack on the article about my attitude towards Muslims and said, you would almost think he admired these people. And indeed, there actually is much about the life of a devout immigrant or that I find worthy of admiration.
Yeah, that's right. The other thing was that I was wondering about is the possibility that you see it catastrophically wrong in your book.
Yeah? Again, I think I'd be the last person to know that, right?
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that my categories are all wrong. Everything is totally
Oh no, maybe
wrong.
you're being had.
Being had. No. Now that I don't think is a possibility. I think I've talked to too many different people. They would have to be all in collusion and plotting to mislead me.
Oh no! So the reason I bring this up because I spent all this time on the internet because I was so curious to find out what your position was on the Iraq War, because that also involved kind of an estimate or an idea how those Muslims in Iraq would react to the democratization process.
Ooh.
But I didn't find it. But I did find this one, which you wrote on the 9th of April, 2003, which was just after the Americans went into Baghdad. And it says, in all likelihood, the pictures Americans saw on every news network Wednesday morning will be the ones we see on the covers of news weeklies when they run their year-end wrap-ups next December. Jubilant Iraqis dancing around the toppled statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square. Citizens of all stripes wiping their shoes on torn-down propaganda posters. After September 11, this cannot be the story of the decade, but it will be the story of the year because it is an historic event. And that was a couple of Iraqis with the wrong.
Well, we now
dialect.
know. Yeah, we now know. as it happens, I think that Americans did make it the story of the year at the end of the year.
Perception
things,
again,
but
that's right.
it was a wrong perception.
Yeah.
Yep. But it's that's an event that I perceived wrongly watching it on television. I think that I'm less likely to be wrong about what I write in this book, because the book is the product of many trips done across a long period of time in person. You know.
right.
So.
And I thank you for that, because it's wonderful. Regardless of the conclusions you draw, I think it's fantastic that someone from the US actually takes the trouble also to analyze Europe as a unit of analysis, because we don't do this.
Okay.
So
Well,
I want to thank you very much
all right.
for that, and ask for an applause, and then turn it over to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Joris. Thank you. That's good.
So standard procedure at the John Adams Institute, we now have this drone. And since we know that you can use a drone to execute people and still get the Nobel Peace Prize, we use it. So if you use more than 3 sentences for your question, the drone will be activated. So a good question is: 1, thank you for being here, it's wonderful. 2, I'd like to ask a question about da-da-da. And 3, the question. So that this is meant as an encouragement.
Yeah.
Did everyone catch that question? All right.
The question was, she wondered what I meant by assimilation. An interesting thing that I found when I was reporting this book, I talked to a lot of politicians of very different backgrounds. And one of the things I asked all the politicians who had a reputation as being really hard line on immigration, and by that I mean not only Nicolas Sarkozy or Jürgen Rutgers of North Rhine-Westphalia, but also your own former Interior Minister Rita Verdonk, whether they liked assimilation, which I think of as sort of like being just totally blending in with the culture of the country, or integration, which I think is meant as a much looser thing, where you can maintain your culture and simply have to obey the laws. All of them said that they didn't favor assimilation, they favored integration. So integration seems to be the big European, the preferred European term to assimilation. Personally, I think I tend to be much more demanding. I would tend to be more along the lines of Otto Schily in Germany, who said the best kind of integration is assimilation. I'm afraid I don't think I don't think everyone has the same ideal as, say, the French, who traditionally have expected their newcomers to France from everywhere to become as typically French, as culturally French as they possibly can. But I think that is probably a good aspiration for any society. So my idea of integration, I think, is probably fairly demanding, and that might be why, in certain cases, I might see people as less integrated than someone else would, or less assimilated. Yeah. The reason I said that about France is that again, relying on polls. If you and this tends to surprise certain people who know France only from what they've seen of the banlieue riots on television. When you ask, young youths in the suburban housing projects, do you feel like a blank? Do you feel like a Frenchman? Do you feel like a Belgian? It's consistently France that gets the highest number of affirmative responses. Yes, I'm French. I'm French like anyone else. I'm just French. And that actually doesn't surprise me. I think that the French, for a couple of reasons, I think France is more, while none of the European countries is really a country of immigrants in the sense that the United States is, France has more of that than other European countries do. You ask about the United States. When we say we have 5 million Muslims, many of those are so-called black Muslims, the people who entered Islam through the Nation of Islam and through Elijah Muhammad and later Louis Farrakhan. They're a different type of group. They're a native group, and it's not really right to talk about assimilating them as we would foreigners. The estimates vary on how many Muslims there are of immigrant stock, but I mean they've done vastly by every measurement they're vastly better off in the United States than they are in Europe. In terms of per capita income, they not only have more money, but they have higher per capita incomes than the average American. But and so because of this, Americans tend to pat themselves on the back and say, "Oh, this is the magic of the American system of assimilation." But I think there is more to it than that. I think we had a bit of a head start. We have a very large group of Iranians who came in the wake of the Khomeini revolution. They tended to be the elite. They tended to be secular, people, the people who would flee a regime led by a, Shiite fundamentalist, sort of Marxist-influenced leader. So they were rich and they were secular, and since the Shah's Iran was a very Americanized place, in a lot of ways they had a lot of contacts. They were in a way pre-assimilated. They're a bit like the people who came from Cuba after Fidel Castro. So that is part of the thing that makes it easier for us to assimilate our Muslim immigrants. But the other thing is, I think there's also a question of size. This, if you say about 2 million or so Muslim immigrants, that's less than 1% of our population. That's not really very impressive. American cities are very democratic. If you had Muslims in the proportion that Europe has them, they would have there would be tens of millions of them, and they would be concentrated in certain cities, which they would begin to control politically. And then in the atmosphere of in the atmosphere of American public opinion in the wake of 9/11, I think that would make people very nervous. So you might have the whole family of problems that Europe has. So I think we're doing a really good job of assimilating our Muslim immigrants, but I think it also might be an accident. Well, now what you're asking me for is my own political opinion, and the reason you have to ask me is I've tried to sort of keep political opinions out of my book, but I'll give you my opinion on things now. I do tend to think that the nation state is the tried and true institution that has provided us with most of our rights and our sense of security, and that there are advantages to surrendering sovereignty to multinational bodies like the European Union, but I think the disadvantages are greater.